Hey everyone, welcome to this week's release of the Hashrate Happy Hour podcast. Today's podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, the Texas Blockchain Council, a Bitcoin-first, nonprofit industry organization working to make Texas the jurisdiction of choice for Bitcoin mining and blockchain innovation. They will be hosting North America's premier policy conference for Bitcoin and the digital asset ecosystem on November 15th through the 17th in Fort Worth, Texas. For more information, please visit their website at texasblockchaincouncil.org. This episode is very special because not only did I get to sit down with my friend Kyle Herron, but we were recording it live from Miami for the Bitcoin 2023 conference. We were able to sit down together at the rooftop pool, and we had an absolute blast. I honestly think we could have recorded a whole nother episode and touched on more philosophical and life topics, but Kyle and I had to get to the Satoshi Action Benefit dinner that Cryptech Solutions hosted, and so we ended up keeping it to just about an hour. Kyle is the COO at Frontier Mining. Frontier Mining is a Bitcoin mining hosting provider company that has over 25 years of IT experience. They leverage the latest large-scale mining infrastructure and work hand-in-hand with local governments to ensure that your miners are online all the time. Kyle's coming to this conversation from a very unique and wide-spanning background as a serial entrepreneur with extensive experience in the music industry, and he also has considerable exposure to the traditional data center industry as well. During the show, Kyle and I discuss the transition from music, entrepreneurship, and creativity into the world of technology and Bitcoin mining. We dive into how Frontier Mining operates within the Bitcoin mining ecosystem. We talk through the differences and similarities between a traditional data center and a Bitcoin mining facility when it comes to the power procurement side of things. Kyle shares his insights on how traditional data centers are going to start emulating Bitcoin mining facilities due to the unique cost-saving operations. We discuss what edge computing is and how it's going to start to decentralize the traditional data center industry. And lastly, we wrap up the show talking about how small towns are embracing the data center and Bitcoin mining facilities as a way for them to start ushering in some of these new age jobs to an otherwise stale work environment. As I said at the top, we were fortunate to be able to record this episode live from Bitcoin 2023, and Kyle and I had an absolute blast recording this episode. So with that, I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation with Kyle Herron. Awesome. All right, well, let's kick this off.
Let's do it, man. What's that? That's my brew. Yes, I got. Actually, I'll crack
you
it.
should crack. No, you should do it on.
I love that.
Hold on. Oh, there you go. Crack it. There.
Welcome to Triple H. I'm Kyle. This is Ben. Live from Miami, Frontier Mining, Sunnyside Digital. Ben, welcome to the show.
All right. See, hey, we're here live in Miami. We're kicking this thing off in a totally new way. I love it.
I love it, man.
Welcome, everybody. It's the Hashrate Happy Hour podcast. We've got Kyle Herron with Frontier Mining. Kyle, how you doing, man?
Doing so well, man. Miami, Florida, during Bitcoin week. It's awfully fun out here, I have to say. It's hard to go at night without having a very, very good time. I mean, our community is so eager to get away from their keyboards and get out in the world. So I'm grateful to be down here. Always am grateful to get to come together with our community. And I'm especially grateful for getting to do a podcast with the great Ben Walsh. I really appreciate the invite, man. I'm looking forward to this.
It's very flattering. Thank you. Cheers to that.
Cheers,
That's, Bitcoin 2023.
Absolutely.
Cheers. I was surprised. I thought for sure they were going to have a mechanical bear in front of the Miami Convention Center. I thought that would have been very fitting. They don't even have the bowl.
They had the bowl, well, because it's a bear market. But the bear would have been hilarious.
Yeah, the bear would have been perfect.
You know what's funny though, and what I love about Bitcoiners is like you'll never meet a Bitcoiner in person who will tell you that we are in a bear market. The right when I walk into the conference, the first thing someone says to me is, "We're out of the bear market," and I'm like, "Why?" And he's like, That was just about the end of the conversation. There's never really any quantitative data to back it up. I think it's just, we are all bulls if we're still here at this point.
Yeah, and I think we're all at the core and at the heart of it all. We're all just bullish on the technology, where like Bitcoin is going, and then you and I, in the bulk of our conversation, we're bullish on like the actual infrastructure, the mining, and the part that's securing the network. So. Yeah, I know. It's hard to admit that you're in a bear market. That's for sure.
I mean, well, look, the bottom line is that if you weren't bullish, you wouldn't still be in the bear market, right? You probably would have left the industry by this point. And that's what happens during a lot of these cycles. I mean, we've been blessed with Frontier to have now run a business that's got its feet really wet in this industry back in 2015 and then formally became Frontier late 2017, early 2018. So I like to tell people we're bear market experts, man. Like we have spent most of our company's cycle in the bear market. And frankly, that's where this industry is forming in its strongest form, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're at this awesome networking event. Shout out to Bit Digital and Sam Tabar of that team over there last night. And it was amazing to be in that room because you realize that room was primarily made up of people who have been able to survive. And what a cool community to be a part of, because honestly, in our space, if you can survive, you will thrive. But first step is surviving and then thriving.
You have to survive.
Yeah. If you try it the other way around, you become what we've seen in the space, which is probably bankrupt.
That's right.
It's the reality.
That's right. So I want to go into your past because your background is super interesting. And for the listeners, this is Kyle and I's first time meeting in person, so we're getting to
feels like we've known each other.
I know it feels like we have, and so it's fun to get to like hear more about your background. You have a very entrepreneurial background, and from coming into the show, I always do a little bit of homework.
Yeah.
Try to a lot of music.
So
I'd love for you get into your background, and then how did it lead to Bitcoin mining?
Yeah, it just goes to show that life is a really, really long road if you choose to make it one, right? I mean, I think many of us just let the days pass by. My whole, sort of come to Jesus moment, if you want to call it that, was when I was around 19 years old. But I said, I'm going to really pursue my passions aggressively. And that's exactly what I've been doing really for the last 10 years of my life. So it all began with, we're looking okay?
Yep,
Perfect.
We're good.
First live HHH podcast. So you never know what's going to happen here. But in any case, what I was mentioning is about a decade ago, I really chose a point in my life where I said, I'm going to start pursuing my passions aggressively. And part of it dates back even further, but it was primarily when I was younger. I just really felt directionless for the most part. I think I generally just kind of flowed with where society told me to go, whether that was to be an athlete, which I did for many years of my younger life, whether it was to try to get the best grades in school, go to a college, et cetera. I mean, I was following what you can consider to be a more conventional and traditional path, but the reality is it was not fulfilling. And that all came to fruition for me in my freshman year of college, which feels like it was so long ago. And at the same time, yesterday, right? That's a really formative time of our life. And during that period, I just realized that I had made a lot of wrong decisions that had led me to that point. I was in the wrong school, the wrong programs, pursuing the wrong major, really. And it was not necessarily anything to do with college or the school. It had everything to do with not having enough time with myself and understanding what I wanted to do with my life. Right. So I came back home after my first semester in college and was at an interesting crossroads in my life. My mom, thank goodness for her, and my dad, they came to me and said, look, you can either continue pursuing school or you can work, but you're not going to sit in the couch. It's just not the family I come from.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, I'm going to pursue school. School did not necessarily get me excited. What came after school did, though. But during school, I felt an interesting drive to do something more because I had time. I was a community college student living back at home. I didn't necessarily have all of the, interesting components of college to drag me into. So I had time. And with time, you can do a lot of special things. I always encourage people to try to create as much time in your life for nothingness, right? Give yourself time just to breathe and think and just allow downloads from the universe to come in, because that's ultimately where your next big idea is. And for me, my big idea came in the form of my father saying, Kyle, just do something you like. Just start with that.
Yeah.
And I knew I really liked music, right? So that's where music came into the picture for me. I was an avid fan for many, many years. I come from a family of creatives and artists. And so
it's awesome.
My, I saw this opportunity to say, let me just try it, right? Let me see what I can do. I can't play an instrument to save my life though. So that cut out a lot of opportunities. Yeah. And it ultimately what led me into it, I said, I'm going to try to tackle it the way that I best know how, which is I'm going to try to build something, right? So it started as just getting involved in the music community. It evolved then into a blog that I played around with a little bit called Wings to the Mind. It then from there evolved into me getting involved with a local concert production company down in Orange County, California, where I was based. And then where it really came to a head and where this entrepreneurial journey kicked off was with a good friend of mine. I'm going to give him a special shout out, based down here in Miami. Dre Navarro and I, we came together and said, we love music. We had been attending concerts and being a part of the community for so long. We said, why don't we just try it ourselves? And that took us down a path of launching a company called Beats for Better. We ran that for about 3 years back in my my early 20s. So it feels like a long time ago now. And
time ago, right?
Yeah,
I'm
right.
joking.
Really only 9 years ago. But again, it just shows how much you can pack into life. So the long version of a long story is we essentially started this company, Beats for Better. We were really wanted to do concert production, but we wanted to do it with a philanthropic twist. So we donated a portion of our proceeds back to music related charities. And that's what kind of kicked off the journey in the music space. I said, I'm going to go with this full bore ahead, right? And worked my way all the way up the ladder to working at Columbia Records, which I felt like was going to be the door that was going to open for me to pursue corporate music and to be a corporate music guy. And the minute I got up there, the minute I realized I didn't want to be there, and entrepreneurship called yet again. So there's so much more to tell you about what happened after, but that's where I started and stopped in the music space.
Okay. So did the transition happen then kind of right when you hit corporate and you're like, hey, corporate is really not the route that for me?
It's a great question.
Was that when it was like, okay, here's Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining? The transition from music and
the most
passion,
important part, right?
Like, how did that transition to passion in Bitcoin mining?
Totally. And that's what I love about the Bitcoin space, right? Is that we've only been around for 10, 12 years, even with Bitcoin in existence.
Institutional, yeah.
But I mean,
like at scale.
Bitcoin's existence, period, was 2009, 2010, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's when the white paper was written.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of getting real involvement in this space from institutional capital, that wasn't until 2020, 2021. So we had this big gap of different cycles of people that came into the space long before we saw institutional capital come in. And we all came from different walks of life. I've seen people, of course, that came from the data center and power space, but really prior to that, it was a lot of free thinkers and creatives that entered into the Bitcoin space, seeing this as an opportunity to further creativity, to further democratization of access to the financial ecosystem through something like Bitcoin. And that's not necessarily what drew me, but I've always loved to see the makeup of our community. How I landed in this wacky world of cryptocurrency and blockchain was a very circuitous path, as is for many folk that land in this space. I was pursuing the music industry aggressively. I got into the corporate side of the space. It wasn't that the music industry at that level wasn't interesting. It's just, and to give your listeners a little bit of education on what happens at music at the highest levels when you're looking at the Taylor Swifts and the Adeles and the Harry Styles, et cetera, and how does that work? It's just another business. It's not creative freedom. It's all designed around how can you maximize margin ultimately, just like any other business. And for me, it just felt like it was manufactured too much for what I felt was supposed to be a free-flowing open field, right?
It's the most disappointing part about all of that type of stuff. I'm coming from a background in sport management where you think the guy that gets on the teleprompter is like this impromptu thing. He's out there dancing his ass off. It's scripted. That's all that.
Because at the end of the day, look, I mean, I've now had the opportunity to run a large scale business for 5 years, and I recognize that, your bottom line is critical in any business you run, whether it's something in a highly creative field or whether it's something that's maybe in a more highly formalized and structured field. And music is no different, right? So I just felt this concept of manufactured creativity didn't sit right with me. That felt like an oxymoron that I never wanted to play with. And so ultimately that led me out of the music industry temporarily. I will say I will be back.
Ooh.
Yes, that definitely exists in my future. And maybe we'll fuse in our crazy world of blockchain in there. But ultimately what that led me to was then down a really interesting path of pursuing technology. So that was the next step for me, right? While I was a student in college, I was running Beats for Better. Prior to exiting the music industry as a whole, I was still throwing concerts on the side and met a great guy named Nick while I was in college who came from a land far, far away known as Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley in the mid 2000s was very, very interesting and compelling to a college student because we knew that there was a lot of capital and there were a lot of successful people coming out of there. That was right during the rise of Snapchat, where we saw one of the youngest billionaires in the US form. And I just said, well, that certainly seems like a path that would be interesting because I know that to enable my dreams, I'm going to need some level of financial success, right? I'm going to need some level of financial support. So I met Nick. Nick comes from Silicon Valley. Nick says, hey, I've got this crazy app idea. Many startup entrepreneurs that are listening to this probably have heard that exact phrasing said to them before. And so we went down the path of building an app together. It's not a story worth sharing here because our time is too tight today, but
I know.
Built an app together, raised money, completely failed, had to rebuild it all over again, and looked myself in the mirror with one of my friends who I worked on this other project with. And we sort of said to ourselves, businesses are hard, right? I had now gone through 2 cycles of building a company. I had Beats for Better and this other company, which was called Filter.
Yeah.
And neither of those really lifted to the degree that we wanted them to. So neither of those businesses had lifted up to the degree that we wanted them to. And we looked ourselves in the mirror and basically said, starting a business is hard, right? But should it really be this hard, or can we structure a start to it that maybe got a little bit more of a formalized process? So that led to the development of a company I built called CO. I ran that company for about 3 years while I was in college and out of college. And that business was basically designed to work with early stage entrepreneurs to help them build businesses. Essentially take the best practices of what we learned from not successfully building businesses. And we ran that and it went okay. But as probably no one is surprised to hear, when your clients are also startups, they don't necessarily have a whole lot of capital available to pay your bills. And so that business, albeit still managed to run for another 3-4 years after. But during that time, and this is where the transition to crypto came into the fold. During that time, this was now right around 2015, 2016. So crypto is starting to make its way, not necessarily into the mainstream, but the conversation's starting to be had within the tech communities, right? I'm running CO. I'm starting to get word about crypto. I see a documentary on Ethereum with a buddy of mine. And at the time, Ethereum's ICO had just been launched. So this is right around 2015, 2016. My friend and I say, hey, let's go buy some Ethereum. We ended up buying Ethereum at, I think it was $8 at the time. And now granted, we had just come out of college and we had a startup, right? So we didn't have a lot of cash available, but we said, hey, we can at least throw 50, 60 bucks into it. Well, that 8 turned into 30 really quickly. And our 50 that we threw into it turned into 500 before we knew it, right? That math doesn't play out perfectly, but it did really feel like that. It was just a snap of fingers. So we ended up in this cryptocurrency ecosystem completely unintentionally. We sort of fell into the space.
So you bought Ethereum and that's what roped you in.
So it
was kind of the boom of the currency itself. So it was the draw of, hey, look, this went from 30 to $500.
It was nothing more than a couple of broke recent graduates who had started a business, poured basically their life savings into it, looking for a way to possibly try to multiply their capital just a little bit. And it turns out that Ethereum was interesting enough to really multiply it.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening those following years in the 2015, 2016, 2017 stretches, we just went way down the crypto rabbit hole, and for no other reason than just trying to multiply our money, because at the time, those were mostly ICOs and frankly, projects that did not have any legitimate substance to them. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we remember those days where it was essentially just a really attractive landing page and a quick pump and dump scheme that for us was, this gateway into a world that we had never seen before, right? This idea of decentralized money, this idea of even being able to almost crowdfund a business was still a relatively new concept at the time. And crypto was starting to do that at real scale. I mean, businesses were raising $30-40 million in 4 weeks with essentially a crowdfunding platform. Man, that was the idea of these early tokenized companies. So it was a strange time, Ben, to say the least, but it was enough to draw me into the space. And I'll pause there because there's more to be said, but
no, I love it.
A lot to dig into.
I love it. And
space.
So again, you look at frontier mining, and I know your partner is coming from the traditional data center industry. Was that kind of what then started to bridge the gap of like, hey, this business functions very similarly to even like GPU graphic card?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure at that time it was a lot of like GPU type mining.
Yep.
So was that then the bridge into, let's get you out of Ethereum, let's get you into Bitcoin?
You're basically reading my story without knowing it, man.
I love it. All right.
And there's definitely a lot of truth in what you just said. The journey into mining is an interesting one, right? I've spent a lot of time this conference talking to people about what mining is, why mining matters, and why we are still around. Because a lot of people think that mining in the way that Bitcoin mines on a proof of work-based mechanism shouldn't exist anymore. And I don't necessarily believe that to be the case. But all that to be said, we are a niche industry, right? So the idea of me getting exposed to mining had to be through a very, very calculated path, because you just don't get exposed to mining in most scenarios, even if you're exposed to the crypto space as a whole. For me, how it ended up happening was, I had exposure to crypto, right? I was investing in it. I was playing around with it. I was learning about it, but it was still, the industry as a whole was just very, very immature at that time. Now, during this stretch of running CO, which is this previous business that I had started, I'm getting involved in crypto. And then my friend from when I was 6 years old and I reconnect. His name's Arlen Whitfield. He's CEO of Frontier. And you can probably see where this story ends up playing out, right? So we end up reconnecting because he saw what I was doing with CO. And he was working in corporate America, which you'll see as an underlying thread to this whole story. And he sees the speech that I give and he calls me and says, what are you up to, man? And I said, well, I'm doing this, kind of startup consulting company. And he said, I'm really interested, man. Like, can we talk? Long story short, I end up hiring him, right? So he comes down to our office, and I'll never forget, he was working for me at the time, and we had a big incubator that we worked out of, and he was always off to the side in some side room. And I was like, I don't have you working on any projects that really need to have you in a side room. He was on phone calls. I'm like, you have no phone calls scheduled today. Well, lo and behold, he was in the early stages of better understanding the world of cryptocurrency mining. I like I said, I hadn't known that at the time, but what I did know is that we all had a collective interest in crypto. Now, Arlen is a self-admitted nerd and a seriously impressive engineer. So he had been building building computers his entire life because his father comes from a 3-decade background in the data center space, the conventional data center space. And his dad's like a second dad to me, and I've known him since I was a kid. So him and I, we just always circled around the data center world, but it was very much so unintentionally. It was just because we were exposed to it through his father, right?
Yeah.
So Arlen one day comes down to the office, says, "Hey man, this crypto thing is cool. By the way, just out of curiosity, this incubator that you're running CO out of, do you guys pay for power here?" And I said, "No." And all the miners on the podcast, their eyes are probably lighting up saying, "Well, that's an opportunity." Right.
Yes.
And so what ended up happening was that this is a great aspect of the story. So we had a storage closet essentially that was off to the side that we converted into a mini office for our interns. Right. And Arlen comes down and says, "Hey man, I grabbed a GPU chassis from my dad, have a couple graphics cards laying around that I was playing video games with. And turns out I can basically daisy chain them all together and create crypto." And I said, "Well, that's cool. But what do you need?" He's like, "Power." I'm like, "Great. Ours is free." So he brings his GPU miner down. He plugs into this office of interns. We crank the AC up in the office or crank it down, I should say, to like 62 degrees. Those interns were still sweating, man, off of one open air GPU machine that was running.
That's awesome.
But ultimately, that gave us the first shared exposure to mining. And what ended up happening was within the following probably 2-3 months of that, Arlen came to me and said, "Hey, I really think this is something that we should think about more seriously. This business has some real legs to it.
Yeah.
My dad can help us get exposure on the data center side." So through a series of interesting events that we don't have enough time to dig into today, Arlen and I locked arms and we said, "Hey, we're going to do this for real." And that was about, I want to say around Q4 2017, where we really shook our hands and said, we're going to get after it. And then lo and behold, January 2018, Frontier Mining LLC is formed and the journey begins.
Perfect. I want you to now tell us, who is Frontier? What are you doing? How are you doing it? And just, it's a perfect segue. So thank you for the tee up there.
Sure.
Who is Frontier?
Yeah, absolutely. So our background is critical to understanding who we are because we never were necessarily intending to build a large scale mining company. That was not the vision initially. In fact, the vision initially was to do what we were already doing, which was just ultimately building a bridge for the average person to get exposure to this space, right? So we were building machines for ourselves, running them in places like incubators, offices, basements. I mean, basically anywhere we could find.
Sure.
Right. And all we did was start posting on our social media channels a little bit and saying, "Hey, look at this cool thing we're doing." Well, as it turned out, a lot of our higher net worth friends at the time reached out to us and said, Bitcoin's getting interesting. And this is late 2017, early 2018. Bitcoin had just hit 20K basically on New Year's. And people were looking for ways to get exposed. So they came to us and said, "What are you guys doing?" We said, "Well, we can build machines for you and you can run them in your offices and your homes and your basements and your garages and all these places." So that's ultimately how Frontier got started, it was really designed around helping to build a bridge again between the non-miner into the world of mining, right? So we did that. And then of course, as the story always goes in our industry, Bitcoin's price shot down within like 6 weeks of us starting the business. And all of these people who had bought these GPU miners from us called us and said, "We like the mining thing, but this idea of mining unprofitably isn't that interesting. Can you help us cut our electricity expenses?" So this is a lot. It was sort of a business that's been built off the back of many pivots, but our pivot then was understanding that we were going to need to find a way to cut electricity expenses. So that kind of kicked off a journey that we've been on now for the last 5 years or so, where we've been building large-scale industrial mining facilities, of course, partially centered around low power cost. Obviously, that's a leading variable in our space, but that's not really all we're about, right? We recognize that's an important component, but we're big believers, number one, in serving our local communities. So all the sites that we build are really designed around making sure that we're predominantly focused on hiring locals, right? Predominantly focused on hiring from underserved communities. And most importantly, really helping to introduce this world of data center, cryptocurrency, blockchain, et cetera, into many cases, communities that would otherwise never see it. So that's been a big focus of ours over the last several years. The second sort of big tier of what we've tried to do is we started ultimately by building this hosting business, right? So the idea was that we had initially had clients who wanted to cut their electricity expenses. Yep. That led us to building small scale hosting facilities. But of course, as we all know, 2021 was an interesting year, right? And that was right in the middle of Frontier's journey. So we started the business in 2018, 2023 now. 2021 was an interesting year. We had a second moment where we had to pivot. So first moment, our GPU clients made us pivot into hosting. So we needed to help them cut their electricity expenses. We get exposed to ASICs, we get exposed to how to run mining sites, et cetera. The next pivot was 2021, where we saw all these institutions rush into the space.
Yeah.
And we said, well, this is going to be interesting because, we're charging retail hosting rates between, let's call it 7 to 8 cents. These institutions, number one, have way more miners than what we can plug in. And number two, they're not going to pay 7 to 8 cents, right? So what's the next path for Frontier? The benefit for us is that we knew that we came from collectively a 30-year background in the data center space. We also at the time had now come from 3 years of running mining sites.
Yep.
So the logical next step for us was to merge those two worlds together and provide a high-tier site management service to these new institutions that were entering in who had money, could understand spreadsheets, but didn't necessarily understand how to develop a mining site and run it. And so now for the last 3 years of our business, or last 2 years of our business, I should say, while we do still provide lots and lots of retail hardware and hosting services, which we'll continue to do as we believe is important in supporting the mining community, the second big wave of our business has been focused on working alongside these institutional guys. And what started as primarily being their site operations partner, now over the course of the last 6 months, has really turned into being their right-hand man for mining, period.
That's fantastic.
That's Frontier in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, so to summarize very quickly, you started as hosting and you still have that as the business. Like that is still core to your business, but then you are now also providing the management solutions at scale for these big guys, like you said, that may know how to get everything set up, may know how to run a spreadsheet and model things out, but
right.
when it comes to then actually managing the fleet, they need the help there. And that's not an uncommon thing to have outsourced expertise come in and help. So that's awesome. I really appreciate that. So obviously the podcast is, I like to talk about the power side of things,
sure.
And we are going to come back to, like you said, the economic impact that you guys have on local communities. I think that's really important, and we'll come back to that.
Sure.
When it comes to power procurement, how different is it for a traditional data center versus a mining hosting facility? Is there any difference?
Oh, it's completely different. In many ways, there's almost no similarities. Now, a mining site in many cases can be set up where a data center would be, but can a data center always be set up where a mining site can be? Not at all, right? And that's what makes mining interesting, right? The idea that we can sort of live on what many would argue to be like a distributed network, right? That's why you can put mining centers essentially anywhere, right? We have the benefits of not necessarily needing, we're location agnostic in a lot of ways, right? We don't need to be near major metropolitan areas. We don't need redundant power. We don't even need fiber internet, right? I mean, we can live off of Starlink for the most part. Prior to Starlink, we were living off LTE.
Right.
LTE
just satellite internet,
essentially. Miners don't require a lot, whereas a traditional server in a data center requires a lot more. It requires, it requires active cooling. It requires redundant power, redundant internet. It requires being relatively close to a major metropolitan area. It required multiple years of buildings. It requires multiple years of permitting. It also requires multiple millions of dollars. I mean, they just are totally different worlds. They really are. And the big reason why is because miners contain no critically sensitive data on them, right? So unlike a data center that cannot turn off, data centers need to have 5 nines of uptimes. They basically cannot ever go down. A mining facility, as we know, one of its benefits is that it can go down whenever and wherever, right? So they do operate a lot differently. But what we are seeing now is we're starting to see data centers pick up the best practices of mining. Because what we have figured out, the data centers don't know, is that we figured out how to cut their costs down by 90% and produce high computational farms in many ways that look and feel like data centers. So we do see a world where those two worlds get a little bit closer.
Absolutely. When you say the mining world has come in and found a way to cut the cost at a traditional data center, can you touch on that a little bit more?
Well, I mean, this is a crazy statistic, but the majority of traditional data centers can take anywhere from 3 to 5 years to build and can cost upwards of $1 million per megawatt. Right? Any miner on a podcast, listening to this podcast, will know that $1 million per megawatt for a miner is, excuse my French, but it's batshit crazy. Yeah. Not a single person would ever pay that amount of dollars in a mining world because it just would not be a profitable site.
Data centers, 300,000 to 400,000 per megawatt is
that I would argue is on the higher end.
It's on the higher end.
I was just sitting down prior to getting to meet you, Ben, with one of the largest miners out of China, who's now moved their operations to the U.S. following the sort of China crypto ban of early 2021, and I mean, in some cases they pay 80,000, 90,000 per megawatt.
That's not in the U.S. though.
That's in the U.S.
That's
now,
in the U.S.
In the U.S. I'm not saying that the infrastructure is of high quality, but I am saying that miners have found a unique way to significantly cut down on infrastructure costs. Right now, a big reason why is because miners don't require the tender love and care that a data center server requires. Right, so it is a different game, and it's also a different set of margins. Mining margins are a lot tighter than data center margins. So there's a lot of reasons why mining sites are able to cut, or are not necessarily just able to cut the cost down, but why they have to cut the cost down.
Sure. Yeah, I think at one of the after parties here in Miami, I think I heard tier -1 data center is maybe more appropriate for a lot of facilities out there.
I think the reason why is because I remember Compute North actually trademarked tier 0.
They did.
Yeah.
They did.
Now, will that trademark hold up? I'm not sure.
I kind of like it.
Oh, I love it. I
kind of like it.
And that was, I'm going to say it here first. We had that idea first.
I heard
I have
it here
in a notepad somewhere. They beat us to the trademark, unfortunately. But tier -1 is actually probably it emphasizes the point a little bit stronger, right? And that's what we've built with mining sites. But like I said, we're now getting to a cusp where our mining sites are actually starting to feel like data centers, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. And on the power procurement side, so when you're negotiating PPAs, and I mean, I know they're very different animals. Again, you need to have, it's either 5 or 6 nines attached to a data center if you want to be in the upper crust. 99.9999.
Ideally just 100, but yes.
That's really what they're targeting. So I would imagine the PPA discussions are very different with power companies, and power companies are, when they hear data center, they're thinking, well, they can't shut down. And if they shut down, they have power redundancies. Maybe touch on some of the differences there with a hosting facility or a Bitcoin mining facility, just the juxtaposition between a mining facility that can stomach 5% downtime versus a data center company. Those are very different conversations with a power company, aren't they?
It's absolutely a different conversation with a power company, primarily because it's just far more expensive and far more power is required because a data center requires a secondary line that draws into its site, right? A mining site can literally just pull off in some cases, pull off a pre-existing transmission line, substation. It doesn't require an enormous amount of build out to bring a mining site online, whereas a data center site in some cases will require, the most probably egregious spending I've seen is even having a second substation to ensure redundancy. It's not common. You'll typically see like a mobile substation, a primary substation, but it's not out of the question, right? Because think about how critically sensitive the data is in a conventional data center.
Yeah, imagine not being able to buy something on Amazon. It's terrible.
Oh, God forbid, right? I was thinking more about U.S. Department of Defense servers and whatnot, which
actual internet. Yeah,
like critical infrastructure to protecting our country runs on these data centers that operate in 5.9 environments. So it's just a completely different power procurement side. The secondary piece that really changes data centers versus mining centers is proximity to major metropolitan areas, right? Primarily because that's where you're drawing your fiber lines from, or because you have to you're providing services to those cities. So, for example, if you've heard of this concept called edge compute, has that come across your desk, Ben?
No, actually.
So edge compute is basically this idea that the future of data centers will actually look a lot less consolidated. So right now you have large scale data centers plotted in different places in the US, and they distribute out whatever they're holding, they distribute out to their various users through various forms of sending information, right? Whether that be fiber line, satellite, etc. The problem is there is a level of redundancy that occurs with that. So if I'm, for example, tapping into let's say a Facebook server that's in Virginia and I'm in California, there's probably a tiny bit of redundancy that I don't notice, but would be more critical if I needed like a live streaming application. Yeah. So let's say, for example, let's talk about the future of cloud gaming, which I think is a really interesting concept. Cloud gaming is this idea where I'm no longer going to need to have an Xbox in my home because there's an Xbox sitting in a data center, right? And that Xbox that's sitting in a data center connects directly to my TV, and I have a controller, and my controller is playing off an Xbox that exists somewhere else. But as we know from the world of gaming, responsiveness is key to be effective in a video game, right? If you have even the smallest amount of redundancy, you could completely throw off a professional video gamer, right? So edge compute is this idea where we are plotting data centers directly adjacent to all major metropolitan areas, right? Now, here's where it becomes interesting, in my opinion, right? So here's where edge compute is really interesting to me, right? So think about this, Ben. You've got 100 megawatt data center that we'll go back to calling it, we'll call it Xboxes, right? Because I think that's actually an interesting one. So we'll call it a 100 megawatt data center of Xboxes in Virginia, right? Someone in California wants to play off the Xbox in Virginia. Redundancy is too high. Video game doesn't play as smoothly. Doesn't work, right? So data center says, okay, well, one option is that we can go build another 100 megawatt data center in California, right? But the demand is not concentrated just in California. There's people who want to play these Xboxes in Arizona and Colorado and all these other places. Redundancy is too high if it's all isolated in certain areas. So the next tier is this idea of edge compute that I was sharing with you. And edge compute is taking small scale data centers and putting them adjacent to major metropolitan areas. Here's where mining matters in this whole conversation and why I'm even bringing it up. And this is ultimately where best practices of the two worlds get shared. Mining has found a way to basically build small scale mobile data centers. That's what we're really good at. In fact, there are data centers out there now. I'll put data centers in quotes, but data centers that are, or mining centers, we should say, that are 600 kilowatts, 500, 600 kilowatts that are producing Bitcoin, right? Yeah. Imagine taking maybe 600 kW is too small, but let's call it a 3 megawatt small container, right? Like an RK mission critical. Yeah. Imagine taking that, putting it next to a Los Angeles, for example, or a couple of those next to a Los Angeles, and now putting those next to all major metropolitan areas. The concept of redundancy is no longer an issue. You also build this really cool mesh network of data centers that can be redundant on each other, right? So no longer does data center redundancy necessarily have to rely on one data center keeping 5 nines. For example, the future of data centers could be a much more distributed model, very similar to mining sites, right?
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. So it's kind of changed. So you're saying Bitcoin mining is kind of changing the landscape and the thinking behind like the traditional data with this distributed mobile data center type.
Well, that's why I kind of used the phrase earlier that mining is like a distributed network, which it is, right? Yeah. I mean, it's probably, I would argue it's the largest distributed computational network in the world. I mean, I would imagine it is. I don't know what else would be. Now, you were asking earlier, I mean, the question that you initially asked, which is a great one, is, well, Kyle, how's power procurement for mining sites and data centers different? It traditionally has been a lot different. The entire worlds of mining and data centers haven't met in a lot of ways. We look and feel similar, but we're really a very leaned out data center to the point that many mining sites don't even look like data centers anymore. Yeah. But those are just the data centers of today. The data centers of tomorrow may look like a lot more like mining centers. They may look like, not necessarily an ant box per se running a bunch of servers, but it may be a high tier, like an RK mission critical I really like because the founder of RK comes from the data center space. Imagine just a beefed up mining container with GPU servers in it next to a major metropolitan area. High probability that's what the future data centers look like. If you want to have smart cities, for example, with a bunch of Teslas that self-drive, you're going to need to have local data centers. So what we're seeing and projecting will happen is that data centers will look a lot more like mining. Mining will get consolidated within the hands of a few major players. Mining community will either leave mining as a whole or transition over to edge compute.
Interesting.
If I were to make a bet on where the future, sort of distributed computational power goes, I'd say it looks a lot like that.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Support for this episode comes from Sunnyside Digital. Are you ready for the next Bitcoin bull run? Get ahead of the game by building out your Bitcoin mining infrastructure now. Sunnyside Digital is your one-stop shop for everything Bitcoin mining, from transformers and switchgear to racks and miners. With a white glove approach to understanding your needs, they'll provide you with the hardware you need at the most competitive pricing possible. Say goodbye to your sourcing headaches and say hello to Sunnyside Digital. Contact their sales team today at sunnysideinc.ca or via email at sales@sunnysideinc.ca. All right, now back to the show.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know like artificial intelligence, HPC, all of this, which, I mean, the vast majority of it, from what I understand, which is limited,
well, for what it's worth, nobody really understands
I know,
it.
It was very new. But what I understand is that a lot of it is done with like kind of the same type of structure as mining, where they're training these AI models on large data sets, and it needs to be very like linear. I'm probably not explaining this very well. Again, I have a very limited knowledge on all of this, but I mean, all of this AI, which everyone's really excited about, is run on GPUs. That's where I was going with this.
I'm tracking with you completely. I mean, look, the bottom line, AI is cool, right? AI is not even close to its final form though, right? Right now it's really more of a gimmick than anything. I don't see that many practical applications of AI. I mean, ChatGPT is great. ChatGPT will be really cool when it's integrated in like Google Docs, right? That'll be awesome.
It already is.
And they did just they released a beta version.
I think you can get it into Excel. Like I think you can get it into the Microsoft.
I did see it. I at least saw a beta release on that. I think Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, was recently talking about it, an integration with basically the whole kind of Drive ecosystem. But all that to be said, I mean, look, I'm not necessarily talking about those applications of AI and where where these edge compute centers fit within that. I'm talking about when you have AI running all the traffic lights in your city. I'm talking about when AI is driving all the cars in your city. I'm talking about when AI is controlling all the parking spots on the road. I mean, these are really logical examples because these are all things that are human/computer controlled right now. They will move over to being fully controlled by artificial intelligence, but that artificial intelligence needs to be locally run, right? Mining facilities are cool because they can be totally distributed and they can essentially be set up anywhere where the right amount of power and internet is given to them, right? So mining, edge compute, they're a natural fit for each other. HPC is exactly what would go into an edge compute center, right? So if I were to project where this distributed computational world goes is mining consolidates to the hands of the few, right? Miners, some of them leave the space, some of them stay and take their best practices and take it over the HPC world. HPC world will look a lot like it does right now in terms of being consolidated in major facilities until we enter into a world where we need to have more distributed computational power. We evolve into edge compute. Edge compute grabs the best practices from mining. We start seeing mining like containers set up near major metropolitan areas. And before we know it, all of our cities are powered off of what becomes this really cool mesh network that will effectively form. And that's how the future of the world's going to work, in my opinion. It's going to be low redundancy, high distributed networks.
I completely agree with you. It's just the amount of, Bitcoin mining gets all the attention for its power consumption and its growth trajectory, and it's going to boil the oceans and use all the power in the world. But when you peel the layers back and you look at like Amazon and Google, I mean, they have mandates to grow at a gigawatt a year. That's just like their brick and mortar traditional data center space. And
the reality is too, like those narratives they're not legitimate narratives.
No. It's my take on it is it's a lazy clickbaity, type of headline type stuff that they can publish about something they don't understand. Yeah.
It's low hanging fruit. It's taking down an industry that threatens others, right? I mean, if I was the CEO of, there's two different ways you can approach it. But if I'm the CEO of a major bank, let's say, and I hear people talking about, and this is before the CEOs of major banks are educated on Bitcoin, but I hear people talking about, wow, Bitcoin can unbank me, right? And potentially can be a threat to like a JP Morgan Chase, for example. Obviously, there's going to be a high potential that I'm going to go and say, let me look at all the bad things that Bitcoin does, right? Yeah. Bitcoin is dirty energy, right? Bitcoin uses dirty energy. It produces nasty pollutants, et cetera. Cool. Let's go run a bunch of headlines on that.
Yeah.
The good news is that our space is full of a lot of really smart people, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't take one of those smart people to figure out that Bitcoin's actually a net positive for the environment, especially if you were to compare it to other major industries. I mean, even look at something like people often compare it to data centers, right? Which are massive pollutants as well. But then you compare it to like, we call Bitcoin digital gold. Well, what about the excavation of gold and the amount of carbon that we produce? I mean, or the conventional banking system.
I was just going to say the conventional banking system, which again is running on these data centers because they need all of that back end support that nobody's crunching the numbers on.
Totally. And you know what I love too is someone was doing a carbon output study on Bitcoin versus all the other industries. Even when you think about it with something like the traditional banking space, you're right, runs off data centers, et cetera. But what about all the people who have to drive to work every day? What about all the people who are throwing their trash away and using their plastic spoons? I mean, like there are countless examples of how other industries are far more damaging to the environment. Yeah. And the argument for keeping them is that they provide a positive benefit to society. Therefore, their positive benefit outweighs the environmental degradation. Ergo, they are good. Well, we could argue Bitcoin does the exact same thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, all of that I completely agree with. And then I also just going back into like the traditional banking stuff for just a second, because we don't have to linger on it. But I mean, I really see it as just a lazy thing. Like They have an opportunity to be pioneers. I mean, these are traditional legacy banking systems that have supported the fiat system for so long. You have this opportunity to take this new technology to bank the unbanked. Think about how the access that you have to people that don't have the ability to get a bank account for all of the reasons that they can't. It's just lazy. And they're afraid of it, and maybe it's a generational thing, and once the younger generations start to get in, it'll get better. But I think it's an opportunity that they're missing, really.
And I think a lot of them are clicking into it.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of major banks, I do see.
Well, I couldn't get bank accounts for, the business the LLC that I have. It had Bitcoin in it, and I got turned down by 4 banks.
Oh, yeah, we've had the same
Which
problem.
is a weird experience, by the way.
It's very strange.
It's so weird. You think, I'll just go get a bank account, and they're like, Bitcoin?
Yeah. Well, the worst part is
not here.
Here's even what gets even weirder. So the banking system has a lot of work to do in terms of actually banking crypto companies. This is different than banking, like banks integrating blockchain into their technologies. Just the idea of banking a crypto company is so silly to me because they'll go bank like the porn industry, for example, or they'll go bank some startup.
Well,
tech
they
company.
tried to shut that down, but
they have tried to shut that down. That did not work, though.
That didn't work. Yeah, it didn't work.
Not based on personal research. But as far as I'm concerned, the banking system works fine within some of these other edge industries. Oh.
Yeah.
Look at that.
For the audience, if you probably I'll probably do some editing to try and touch up the audio, but that might not come out. We are outside on the rooftop, so
we're in Bitcoin Miami. It's actually a plane that says Pepe is the new Bitcoin, the Pepe coin, the Pepe coin. To be clear, that's when you know you're in the land of cryptocurrency.
Wow.
But I mean, look, the bottom line is that the concept of not banking crypto companies is bizarre to me. You're mentioning though how crazy it is to walk into a bank and have Bitcoin in your LLC's name
weird.
and then say no. Even crazier for us. First of all, we're not a Bitcoin company. We provide services to other people that use computers to create Bitcoin. Like we are at least 3 layers removed from the Bitcoin itself. So we had banks that would bank us for 6 months. We put 6 figures into the accounts with them, and they would call us after they went to our website and saw Bitcoin mining on the front page, and they'd shut it down. You talk about how weird it is to walk into a bank and have them say no. It's even weirder when they write you a letter and say, we're sending you a check of all your funds. Your account is closed as of today.
It's fucked.
And you got clients paying invoices. Like, it's just absolute backwards, man.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Well,
that's part of the battle.
Yeah, and that sadly is starting to happen a little bit more right now. I mean, from what I'm hearing, the banks are getting a little more aggressive about that again. But anyways, like I said, I don't want to linger on that too much.
It's a fascinating topic, man.
Yes.
But I think it's also part of what fuels our ecosystem because you almost need like a David and Goliath sort of atmosphere to keep the crypto zeitgeist as strong as it is. So the fact that we do have this pushback from the major financial ecosystem, to some degree, like I almost look at it as being like a battle worth fighting and a battle worth keeping around just to keep the energy alive.
Yeah. For a conversation later, you always need the op. There's always a white and a black, because if you didn't have the black, what's
theory of opposites, my friend. Totally agree.
That's a deeper conversation for later.
Yeah,
but
we'll save that for non-Bitcoin.
You mentioned positive economic impact for economies.
Sure.
I'd love for you to go into that a little bit more. You mentioned, Frontier when it started was just a hosting to help your clients get into cheap power rates, but now you're carving out a wonderful niche of coming in and supplying the workforce to maintain these facilities.
Right.
How are you guys sourcing talent locally, and how is that all received?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the coolest things about the Bitcoin space is, like I was saying, I mean, we have the ability to create technology jobs in areas that would have never seen it. I mean, I can date us back to an early story of Frontier where we really started to feel what this could look like. And obviously this was prior to, seeing, for example, Riot's Rockdale facility get built, where they're hiring hundreds of people who would have probably never had exposure to Bitcoin, blockchain, even technology as a whole. There was a story that we had, though, when we started, when we were on a site in Coshocton, Ohio. It's actually a site people still talk about today. And it was Is
it the Pepe thing again?
You use the helicopter.
It's the Pepe banner again.
It's the Pepe banner. Pepe is a big deal this year. I'm not.
I
frankly,
think it's the ordinal stuff.
It's definitely the ordinal stuff. I haven't bought into all of that enough yet. Like I have my hands full with figuring out how to run an ASIC machine. So like I'm not quite sure what's happening. But all I know is I was out last night at Hyde in Miami. Shout out to Hyde. Hopefully this gets me a free table there next time since I'm mentioning you on the podcast. And Pepe was everywhere. He's dancing on stage. It was the whole thing. And again, I'm not even the person to ask about what that means or what it is. But all that to be said, back to the positive economic benefit of Bitcoin mining. So we had a site in Ohio, and it was a really good example of what the impact of our industry could be. This site was a former paper plant, right? And it was the primary employer of a very, very small town called Coshocton, right? Coshocton's a town of a couple thousand people at most, right? So the largest employer is a big deal. I mean, that can easily represent generations of workforce, right?
Yep.
And that paper plant shut down because the demand for paper isn't quite as high as it used to be. Thank you, internet, for that. Thank you, computers, for that. Probably Steve Jobs and Bill Gates I should be pointing my fingers at. But all that being said, the bottom line is that we went to this town and we saw this paper plant sitting on 90 megawatts of power, not being touched. It was just sitting there. And we said, well, we can go drop a couple containers and start creating Bitcoin. And oh, by the way, local city council, we also are going to need some people coming out of your technology training program at your local college. And by the way, those generations of hard laborers, we could use them to come build out some infrastructure at the site. And all of a sudden, you revitalize communities that might have legitimately collapsed because their largest employers no longer exist there anymore.
And it happened to the Rust Belt. So
totally.
yeah.
Totally. I mean, it's happened across the board. I think the other one that's been really cool to see is out in the West Texas region, where obviously mining has been a massive driver of a new type of job, right?
Yeah.
I think the idea here is that we're looking to equip these generations of talent, not necessarily just with the same skills that their grandfather had, but with skills that are going to be relevant to their future, and not skills that are just relevant to their future in terms of how to run an ASIC miner, but also what is Bitcoin? How does Bitcoin work? How do you introduce it in your portfolio? How do you use it to build a life for your children? I mean, there's a lot more to it, and we're opening up rural communities access to Bitcoin, which to me really speaks to the Bitcoin narrative, right? So I'm proud of the work that companies like Frontier are doing, but I'm happy to say that we're not the only one.
Yeah. Well, what I'm excited about is you see a lot of buzz around job loss from artificial intelligence, and I forget the name. I think he was a presidential candidate. Is this the damn Pepe thing again? It is.
I actually, to be honest, I do not think you should cut it out.
At this point, yeah, that's incredible. Pepe is the next Bitcoin. It just keeps flying right over us. It's hilarious.
Directly over us.
There was a presidential candidate who was running on a platform based on universal basic income because
Andrew Yang?
Yes.
He's fascinating.
Solely because I think it's the truck driver workforce is maybe the single largest workforce in the United States. That was
his hill that he was dying on.
And AI is gonna, make that obsolete. Self-driving cars and things like that. That it's all around this technology theme. So, anyways, what's exciting is those people are gonna need a job, and if you take more of the blue collar workforce and transition them into, I don't know what color you want to call their collar, but take them from blue collar to, maybe
not
like green collar and get them into technology, get them into the data centers, get them into, Bitcoin mining facilities. And I think that skill set can easily transfer.
I think it's about repurposing pre-existing skill sets versus trying to retrain. Because the idea that I'm going to go, the Andrew Yang platform is an interesting one from the previous presidential cycle. Because Andrew Yang, he created a really compelling argument. Hey, truck driving workforce is huge in the US, right? Electric automated vehicles are going to be here in a snap of the fingers. Well, they're not, by the way. It doesn't happen that fast. Number one. Number two, they're expensive. And number three, the technology takes a while to get approved. You don't just overnight have giant 18-wheelers driving on the road. So I do think we're a ways away, but it was a really, really, the counter argument, of course, to that is, okay, let's just assume that all these truck drivers are out of work, right?
Yeah.
So we just put them through like a like a coding school. Like it was a maybe
Yeah,
not a counter argument, but the argument that we were going to retrain this workforce, and this is something that generations of their family had never done before, to me was a crazy concept. What we can do though, and again, this is just me putting my Bitcoin mining hat on, is we can repurpose their current skill set for an environment that will be around for the future.
That's right.
Will Bitcoin mines or data centers be run by AI in the future? Maybe, but that's a lot further away than a truck driving itself.
Right. Yeah. So it's exciting. I'm excited about that.
Totally
so
agree.
what are some of the challenges though? Because I mean, so again, we've been talking about it quite a bit, Bitcoin mining, all of the energy usage, like it has a reputation. I mean, what are some of the challenges that you guys are running into approaching some of these communities? Because I mean, to you and I, this is like a no-brainer, perfect fit, but some of these communities you go into and some of the communities that I've seen, it's not such a good fit for them when you talk to them.
Yeah.
What challenges are you guys seeing?
To be honest with you, we haven't seen... We've been fortunate, I should say. We have not seen a huge amount of pushback from residents, right? Residents generally welcome us in with open arms because, the cool thing is that we're cool. Like Bitcoin mining is interesting and it's sexy and it goes into places that have never seen. I mean, the coolest store, the places, some of these places have is like a Walmart, right? Like this is interesting and fascinating technology. And in many companies, Frontier included, use Bitcoin mining as a tool for the community to get introduced to blockchain. So college introductory classes, tours of the sites, all that kind of stuff becomes available for the community. So frankly, we don't get a ton of pushback from the community. We've had instances where the community is like, hey, these things are too loud, right? That's probably the number one pushback we've received if our containers are too close to a residential area. Get some noise complaints, but realistically, most mining sites are very remote nowadays, so they're not going to be near residential areas. The greater pushback, and I don't know if pushback is the right word, but more so concern that we've seen is with the local regulators, because they just do not have a rule book for how to allow a Bitcoin mining site to get developed in their town, right? So a great example of this is a site we've been developing in South Carolina, and we launched back in Q4 of 2022. Great location, great power rate, great co-op. City was excited, lots of good talent, all the good things, right? But their permitting office had never permitted a data center before, much less a mining facility. So when we went to them and said, hey, we're doing this mining facility thing, they said, well, are you a building or not a building? Are you consuming a lot of power? Are you not consuming a lot of power? Are you on all the time? Are you off all the time? How many people are you hiring? What do you guys... It just became this long-winded process of educating them on what we actually do, what Bitcoin is, right? Yeah. It's very, very rare that you walk into one of these small communities and you meet the county commissioner and he's like, oh, I have Bitcoin on my portfolio. Like most of them are not ultra familiar with these concepts. And the crazy thing is, and this just goes to show that many of us who live in coastal cities and in more major metropolitan areas have the impression that we are in a super developed country. But the further you move into rural communities, the further you realize that our country still has a lot of progression to do. So we've been to places, honestly, where we've launched mining sites and we've received pushback from the local county. And to even get a meeting with them required us to physically sit in a waiting room and wait for them to open the door for us. I mean, there's no text messages or Telegram. There's in many cases, not even phone calls. I mean, it is a very antiquated world when you move into rural communities. So that's a big pushback, is just getting the new and the old worlds to meet. When they do meet, though, it's generally all hunky-dory.
Yeah.
Getting to that point, it can be challenging.
Yeah. Those are good points. And just to keep a tab on the time and just to make sure that because we've got other things going on tonight. I'd love for you to touch on what are some of the exciting projects that you guys are working on. I'd love to kind of wrap with that and hear, what you guys are working. You've been touching on it, but is there anything like specific and exciting that you can touch on and share?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our primary goal with Frontier during its current business cycle is to build an ecosystem, right? Our vision is that we want to decrease the barrier to entry as much as possible for people that are entering in the space, because we know that over the next 5-6 years, it's not going to be miners mining. It's going to be power companies mining, data centers mining, cities mining, governments mining, all these groups and individuals that first of all, don't know much about data centers in mind to begin with, but secondarily, they don't necessarily want to know. This is not a huge portion of their portfolio. It probably will never be a huge portion of their portfolio.
Yep.
They're looking for white glove, low barrier to entry options to enter in the space. And we really feel with Frontier's background of now having 5 years of professional experience mining, 30 plus years in the data center space, that we're a great candidate for opening that door and building an ecosystem where we're an A to Z solution. And again, not just for buying miners, but for everything from strategizing your mining operation, finding a site, working with the local community, building that site out, acquiring the miners, plugging the miners in, doing all the repair. The idea is we just want to build an all-in-one solution that, again, is designed to really productize mining and make it accessible to anyone of any size. So that's a big, important advancement for us at a very high level. The next tier of Frontier will be moving, ironically, into Tier 0. We really feel that the HPC space is a logical path for us, especially considering the fact that we've become lean data center experts, in our opinion, but we also have expertise in Tier 3 and Tier 4 environments. So we are starting to toy with some of those projects. And then I would say the third sort of vision, the third pillar of our vision for Frontier is that we want to get mining sites to a point where the people at the mining sites can work on the hard problems and the mining site can for the most part, be self-healing. So if we're really at a tactical level, we're working on a lot of smart, intelligent infrastructure at our locations, which will be applied not just to the mining sites, but also to our HPC locations, where we can have sites for the most part be self-governed with little human intervention so that the humans can work on more creative things. Primarily, we're seeing the demand right now existing on the repair realm. So there's a high probability that the future of a Frontier hosted site will actually be less hosted technicians, more smart, intelligent infrastructure, and more repair technicians to make sure that we decrease downtime as much for our miners as much as possible. So tactical and less visionary, but at the same time, critical to really maintain the integrity of the Bitcoin ecosystem.
That's super exciting. And I'm excited to see all of that come to fruition and watch you guys continue to grow. It's fun seeing the transition from the hosting to, really the hands-on and all of the, the things that you guys are building. So that's
actually
fantastic.
All the way from music to that, believe it or not.
Well, music to that. Yeah. Well, and for the audience, Kyle and I are going to go enjoy a dinner tonight too. So we're going to go continue the conversation. Probably going to get more philosophical than we did on the show here.
It's a 4-figure dinner with an open bar. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we're going to be treated right.
Absolutely.
I'm sure we will. Shout out to Satoshi Action Education and Dennis Porter. Super excited for that one.
That's right. Kyle, I want to make sure that you have room for a handoff. I want the audience to be able to get in touch with you and Frontier Mining and all of the great things that you're working on. So please give a handoff to how they can get in touch with you and the company.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start with saying what kind of conversations we're open to, because before I even bother with our contact information, I really just want the non-mining community, the mining community, the non-Bitcoin community, the Bitcoin community, et cetera, to just know that we're an open door to this world. Our mission and our vision here is to create accessibility more than anything to this space, and more so to inspire opportunity within the Internet of Trust, which is this trustless ecosystem that we operate in, which ironically is very trust-based at the end of the day. So we're an open door for entering into this community, and we're excited to continue conversations with people that have been in it for a long time or people that are ready to get into it for the first time. All that being said, how do you track us down? Pretty easy. Frontiermining.com is our easiest place to locate us. You can easily contact me at Kyle@frontiermining.com. Then you can find me on all major social media platforms under Kyle A. Herron. So easy to find. Happy to chat. Ben, thank you again. Love the Triple H podcast, man. And I'm looking forward to supporting this one going forward.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Kyle. You take care.
Signing off.